Today I'm going to be investigating the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. The shrinking of the government. Thomas Jefferson was a firm believer of small governments. Some actions he took were to end the whiskey tax, limit federal power, pay off the government debts, and he even relied on local militia instead of an army. Marbury versus Madison. The case of Marbury versus Madison took place in 1803, right before John Adams left office. He elected William Marbury the Justice of the Peace. John Adams left office before the documents were delivered to the Supreme Court. The documents were held by James Madison, the Secretary of State. Thomas Jefferson told Madison to hold the documents, hoping that Marbury would give up and let Jefferson elect a Republican instead. Unfortunately for Jefferson, Marbury did not and asked Madison to give the documents to the Supreme Court. When Madison refused, Marbury tried to use the Judiciary Act of 1783 to back him up. Unfortunately, since there was no jurisdiction, he failed. Overall, this event was very important because it gave the Supreme Court more power than it had before. The Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase started when the French leader Napoleon Bonaparte convinced Spain to give Louisiana back to the French after they helped the Spanish conquer part of Italy. When the French moved into the Louisiana Territory, Thomas Jefferson worried about the French allying with the British, who they hated. At the same time, the French was worried about the Americans, as they would ally with the British. So the French offered to sell the Louisiana Territory to the Americans. Immediately, Jefferson agreed. The Louisiana Territory was sold for about $15 million. The Lewis and Clark Expedition. The Lewis and Clark Expedition was a secret expedition that Thomas Jefferson asked Congress to allow. The purpose of the expedition was to map out the Louisiana Territory and find a route along the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. The expedition was also called the Corps of Discovery and was led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Along the way, they met a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea who helped them understand the land and acted as a navigator. Eventually, they were successful and they navigated to the Pacific Ocean. In the end, the expedition was successful because their mission was successful, and they also had a better understanding of the land in that territory. The Embargo Act of 1807. After the events of the Chesapeake, which is when a British ship opened fire on an American ship, killing 4 soldiers, the public expected war. Jefferson instead passed the Embargo Act of 1807, cutting off trade with Europe. Unfortunately, this affected the Americans more than Europe. The Congress saw the effects of the act and decided to end it, shortly before Jefferson left office. Essential questions. What makes an effective president? There are many things that make a president an effective one. I believe an effective president must have effective decisions that will benefit the country, even if it hurts some people in the process. Sometimes hurting a group of people ends up being the best choice. For instance, when Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory and the Louisiana Purchase, he put the country in debt because they had to pay about $15 million to the French. But overall, it helped the nation and in avoiding any relations with Europe. What parallels can we draw between President Jefferson and President Obama? Some parallels I can draw between President Obama and President Jefferson is they both did something without proper authority from the Constitution. For instance, President Jefferson didn't have the authority to buy the Louisiana Territory from the Louisiana Purchase, sending America into debt, forcing them to spend about $15 million to pay off. President Obama did not have the approval from the Constitution, nor did he involve the Pakistani government with the assault to capture or kill Osama bin Laden. How does the president's personality affect his leadership? The personality can always affect how someone leads a country. If someone views the rest of the world as a potential ally, that person will try to avoid war at all costs. But if the person sees them as an enemy, they will try to have no problem going to war with them in that sense. For example, when Jefferson had a choice to either go to war with Europe after the events at Chesapeake or not and ignore them, he decided, since he had a hate for Europe, to pass the Embargo Act instead, cutting off all trade with Europe, even though it hurt America more than it did Europe. Does politics trump policy for elected officials? And how important is loyalty to one's political party to good governance? I think that politicians should compromise to get things done instead of trying to gain points for their parties. I believe that Jefferson did this in a number of ways while he was in office. For instance, when Jefferson made the decision of making the purchase for the Louisiana Purchase, he didn't care who supported him or who didn't agree. He just wanted to make sure that there was no possible way that America would have any relations with the British. Is the Constitution meant to be interpreted strictly or loosely? How are we supposed to interpret the words of the Constitution? I think that the Constitution is meant to be interpreted loosely. I think that the Founding Fathers knew that as time goes on, the government and the Constitution would change. I think the best example is the 3/5 Compromise. The compromise stated that all African Americans were only seen as 3/5 of a person. The Founding Fathers, which included Thomas Jefferson, knew that this issue was going to have to change as time went on. Sure enough, the issue did update to its time, and now African Americans have all rights that the whites do. I also believe that we're supposed to view the words of the Constitution as rules until they are updated to their time. What lessons could President Obama learn from the past successes and failures of President Jefferson? I think that the best thing that President Obama can learn from President Jefferson's successes and failures is some decisions go according to plan, but others have consequences. For example, the Lewis and Clark expedition was a complete success because they accomplished mapping out the Louisiana Territory and finding a pathway to the Pacific Ocean. But the Embargo Act, on the other hand, didn't end well for Jefferson. The point where the Embargo Act was supposed to separate America from Europe to avoid war. Unfortunately, the act ended up hurting Americans, putting them in financial debt. This act alone hurt the legacy that Jefferson left.